Expected. So let's begin with a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we're so grateful to have this opportunity this morning, as well as any morning, that we can reach out to you for those that are most uppermost in our mind, that we have requests individually, and we know that you understand that. Allow us to give those to you, to think about them, and to pray for them as well individually as well as corporately. We ask you to be with this class. In Jesus' name we offer this prayer. Amen. Okay. I've sent out a few notes on Mark. Most of you realize I'm going to dwell on Mark for the next month and a half. But before I do that, I'm going to say a couple other things. I don't know if you're aware, but I'm going to give a seminar on the Dead Sea Scrolls at the first weekend in October. I better remember that, huh? At Bayside. Now, it's a small congregation that we support, and when I was there last October, or November, whenever it was, I had offered them an opportunity to utilize seminars, perhaps, that almost anybody could deliver, not Dead Sea Scrolls, but I gave off a whole bunch of them, how to study the Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls, etc. And they immediately decided, oh, wow, that'd be neat to have the Dead Sea Scrolls. Everybody's interested. You could come and do it in the colleges, etc., etc. So that's what I'm going to do for them, is deliver a seminar on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, in the past, I've done that over multiple days and lots of hours. This one is going to be just a couple hours on Friday night and a couple hours on Saturday, and we'll see how it goes from there. I said the Dead Sea Scrolls as if everybody's aware of them. I'll stop sort of right there. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1947 in 11 caves, and has all the Old Testament except for one book.
I got to see the Dead Sea Scrolls when they were here in Charlotte.
Okay, excellent. I'm glad that you did.
They said they'd never be back anymore in Charlotte.
Yeah, I would suggest that if you have that opportunity to do it. I got to see them in Pennsylvania at Philadelphia, as well as San Diego, as well as in Israel, obviously, when I was there. All right, well, in any case, this is not about the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's just that I'm going to be making that seminar, and we've got little flyers for them. And if you're interested, let me know. There's some people talking about figuring out how to go. It's going to be on a Friday night and a Saturday morning, so that you could go down there Friday and come back Saturday evening. It's a hike. Bayside is 6-7 hour drive, so it's not a simple drive, but there are some that are talking about going. Obviously, I need to be there, but outside of that, it's up to you. The other thing I've done is I've got an outline of the book of Mark. If I've got a few copies of that, if you want to see me this morning, I'll give them to you. They're online. Charlotte has them, and so I guess that's about it. Wednesday night, and I'll finish up this introduction. Wednesday night, because Travis is going to be down there with little people, and some camp someplace. I avoided going. I sent Ruth instead. But Wednesday night, I'm going to be taking his place, and we're going to tackle a passage in Mark, the 8th chapter, 22nd verse through the 25th, one of the most remarkable miracles that Jesus ever did. And it's remarkable for a number of reasons. Wednesday night, you can find out what it is. So you'll have to come Wednesday night and listen to me, or get the tape and try to redo it. But it's Mark, the 8th chapter, verses 22 through 25. And I'll let it go at that. Now, we're going to do something oddly different in terms of Mark this morning. We're going to start from the back of Mark instead of the beginning of Mark. And the reason for that is I'm taking Rob's place this morning. he didn't get to finish up Jude. I was very tempted to dive into Jude one last time. Rob's done just a fantastic job. If you got his notes and read them, good. If you haven't, do it. They're excellent. He went in depth, as he always does, and so it was just very well presented. And Jude can be a very difficult text, even though it's a few verses. And he uses all kinds of analogies from the Old Testament. And I would suggest over and over again that you go back to Rob's notes and look at the book of Jude. I won't finish it up. We're going to begin with Mark this morning. Now, open up the Bibles to the 16th chapter of Mark. 16th chapter of Mark. Now, I'm going to say some things this morning that you'll probably have to think about. You don't necessarily have to agree with them. I never expect people to agree with them. I just want you to think about it. If I accomplish that, then I've accomplished my objective anytime that I'm teaching. So rather than begin at the beginning of Mark, the 16th chapter, I'm going to go to the 9th chapter through the 20th, the ones I told you not to bother to read. I'm sure you didn't bother to read it. Or you got a question about it and read it anyway. Almost every one of your Bibles, unless you have a King James Version. Anybody with King James Version? I grew up with King James Version. There's nothing wrong with King James Version. It just doesn't have all the translations, all the manuscripts that were available to us today versus in 1611. That doesn't say anything wrong with it. It's just that, and I became a Christian with King James, so I'm not overly negative about King James Version. It just doesn't have all the information with it. But except for that version, I think every other English translation says something along the 9th verse. And if you'll look at that, you'll see it. Anybody want to tell me what it says?
It says, now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons.
Now that's not quite what I was looking for, but that'll work. I'm sorry.
It says some of the earliest manuscripts do not include verses 9 through 20.
Some of the earliest manuscripts, matter of fact, the two critical manuscripts, the Sinai and the Vatican manuscripts, that's just a reference of where they were either found or where they're at. So don't get too upset about that. Those two manuscripts are the most crucial ones that we have. They do not have the 9th through the 20th verse in there, which tells me to us what? What's the obvious conclusion? They weren't in the original manuscript. They're not in the original manuscript. The 9th through the 20th verse is not in the original manuscript. Well, why do they put them in there then? I've got asked that question about 1,000 times. Why is it still in these versions if they already know that they're not in the original version, in the original manuscript? Is my Bible messed up? Is someone adding information to it? Should they not be doing that? Mark.
It says, but the passage is quoted by Irenaeus and Hippolytus.
That's exactly right. And Irenaeus is writing about 180 AD, and Hippolytus is, good grief, Howard, around 200-ish, I think, 220. That tells us something else, by the way. If Irenaeus, and what it doesn't say there, is that Justin also perhaps referenced it, and he's writing about 140 AD, which suggests to you what? Everybody said, I'm not going to say anything, Howard. It would suggest to me that very early on, the addition to this chapter, or to Mark's, was written down very early. If Irenaeus is writing about it in 180, if Justin is writing about it in 140-ish AD, then we have it early on that this addition took place. People did not like, very quickly, they did not care for the ending of verse 8. And we're going to talk about 1 through 8, and I'm going to try. So we end up with an addition to it. All right? Now, Howard, how do you know that this isn't on there? First place, you have to be talented. No, I got it on. Mike, how come this doesn't work? I got it on. It's green. Just flip it to the next slide. There aren't going to be very many slides. Can you read that? Or if you can't, I'm going to repeat them anyway. You can't read it? No.
That's not what you wanted?
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted. They just can't read it. And I can't blame them. It's up there. All right. Let me say some things about that verse, about this whole passage from 9 to 20 before I dive into 1 through 8. And why Mark undoubtedly left the 8th verse for our benefit, by the way, as well as his readers. The text, the verbiage on verse 9 through 20 is not Markan Greek. The Greek is, how can I say this nicely, is a lot more sophisticated than what Mark writes. Mark was a not overly sophisticated writer in Greek, and we see that through the entire book of Mark. And then suddenly we get into these verses from 9 to 20, and the Greek just startlingly changes. Almost every Greek student that's ever gone through seminaries or whatever is given this passage to translate, and they can see the difference, no matter how strong your Greek is or the lack thereof. And so it's significantly different. There's some other things. If you look at verse 8, then jump into verse 9, you get a discussion of Mary Magdalene as if she doesn't exist in the other verses, but she's talked about in the verses and prior with the 3 women. It's talked about in the 14th chapter. It jumps into the 15th to the 9th verse as if she's the only one there, and we know that there's 3 other women. That's another issue that we have with these verses. Having risen on earlier the first day of the week is a repeat of with verse 8 and 9, etc. And there's a number of manuscripts that have a short verse in it, and I've got it up there on a slide. I'm not going to bother to throw it up there. We'll run out of time. Somebody added it to the 8th verse because they didn't like the 8th verse, and then they kept the 9th through the 20th verse. It goes on and on. These verses just aren't in the original manuscript. It's that simple. And for all kinds of reasons. Textual was one, the references are for another, and the Greek verbiage is significantly different. So let's back up now to verses 1 through 8. Questions? I'm getting sort of astonished looks here. This isn't the first, well, if it may be the first time you've heard that, I don't know. But if it is, yes?
It's quoting red letter in my Bible, Jesus quotations. Are those accurate?
You bring up 2 questions. One of them, are they accurate? No. That's just the first part of it. Secondly, I don't like red letters. I've got them in my Bible, by the way. Pay no attention to them for all kinds of reasons. I know they're kind of neat. They're there. But red lettering in the Bible is somebody's taken the red letters and saying Jesus said them, that was translated into English from Aramaic, because he probably spoke Aramaic, from original writings is in Greek. Do you see what the problem is right away? I mean, original writings is in Greek. Jesus spoke them in Aramaic, not likely to be Hebrew, and Aramaic, and we're taking that and translating it into English, and then we're adding red letters to it. Kind of nice, but not very accurate and not very smart for us just to look at them and say, and I had somebody tell me this one time, I know you're not, but so, well, Jesus had to say it because it's in red letters. Well, that is a translation of somebody's translating it on top of translations. That gets you into trouble. It just is not accurate. It may be kind of neat for references purposes. You can quickly find some of these things, but don't count on them being overly accurate. Now, to answer your question, anything in red letters in the 9th through the 20th verse wasn't in the original manuscript. There's another thing about, I don't want to go on and on. If you look at, there's a 9 through 20 is a compilation of John's, Matthew's in there, Acts. You can pull out the exact quotations from those texts into this. Obviously, someone looked at those texts and rewrote them into Mark's text at the end of this. Now, I make all that point. One, I want you to know this. That's number one. Number two, and this is more crucial, let's get into that 1st through the 8th verse. Because Mark says something here, does something with his graphic portrayal with these women that is directed towards us as well. So let's see what it is. And I'm going to read. No, I'm not. I'm not going to read it. You guys can read as well as I can. Let's just begin it. The Sabbath was over with. Mary and Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, they bring spices to the gravesite. Now, the context around this, and I'm one to always preach context, is that the crucifixion has just taken place, the whole passion has taken place, and as sorrowful as they are, they're walking back to the gravesite to put spices on. Now, why? Well, because they like Jesus, because they were a follower of Jesus, because they want to put spices. Who else put spices on them? We know that from Matthew, we know that from John. Nicodemus and Joseph. They had done it. Now, being a male, whenever Ruth asked me to vacuum something, I do it. I always do what I'm told. No. I do it, and then she invariably decides that it's not good enough and does it again, which irritates me, puts a strain on our 50-some-odd years of marriage, but we repeat it periodically. She never quite trusts that I'm going to do it well enough. These three women couldn't possibly have trusted Joseph and Nicodemus as doing it adequately. So they're going to put spices on. So why did they have to wait till the third day to do that? Anybody? What happens on the Sabbath in Israel? Anybody have a guess? I can tell you that because I've been there. Nothing. I mean, restaurants are closed, the grocery stores are closed, everything's closed. You just can't go buy something in Israel on the Sabbath. And by 6 o'clock when the Sabbath is over with, it's dark and you're not going to be wandering around in a graveyard. So why are they there on Sunday morning? Because they're going to finish a job that they didn't think that Nicodemus and company could have done adequately. They had to wait to go buy the spices till then. And so they're on their way to the graveyard site to finish up the job. That's simple enough, right? That's what they were doing. Okay, what's our next scene that we get here? They journey to the tomb and they're having a discussion. What are they having a discussion about? what's the first thing that occurs in their mind?
Who's gonna roll the stone away?
Yeah, who's going to push the stone out of the way? We don't have Peter, big Peter doing it. That's the picture we have. Probably not that big, but anyway. We don't have somebody strong enough to push this stone out of our way, and we're going to have to figure out how to do it. Doesn't seem to bother them. They keep walking anyway and talking about it. Maybe all three of them is going to get behind it and start pushing it. By the way, most of them aren't rolls. They could have been rolled, but not during that period of time. However, so they're having that discussion. But it means something besides just the fact that they're women and they're not as big and as strong. What is it? What do you think it means? One, the stone is there. I mean, they're having the discussion, right? The stone's there. What would you expect to find inside that tomb? Yeah, if you're taking spices, you stop at a store to buy spices early in the morning, had to knock on the door, wake up, give me the spices on Sunday morning, and they're taking the spices. Who's going to roll away the stone? They do not expect Jesus to have been resurrected. That is Mark's point here. And it's a crucial point because it emphasizes over and over again that Jesus, and eventually was resurrected. They did not expect it. They didn't develop the story. They didn't start right out and say, well, we're going to send out to the world and tell them that that Jesus was resurrected. We're going to develop this story on the side. This is the accusation that's sometimes made from an apologetic standpoint, that the first Christians really made up the story of Jesus. They did not expect Jesus to have been resurrected. Should they have? Absolutely, because he told them multiple times. He tells them in the 8th chapter of Mark. He tells them in the 9th chapter of Mark. He tells them in the 10th chapter of Mark. He discusses it in the 14th chapter of Mark. He told them over and over again it was going to happen, but it didn't register. By the way, that's a hint for Wednesday night. But it didn't register to them. Or it just couldn't comprehend that someone could be resurrected. But that's Mark's point here. It's not just the discussion between three women. It is the fact that these three women did not anticipate the resurrection. Okay? Comments? Questions? Does that make sense to you? It's an important point. It's an apologetic point. It is a point in which you can emphasize over and over again to anyone challenging you that the resurrection wasn't manipulated by early Christians. It was something they didn't expect, and it happened, and it's just shocked the daylights out of them. Okay? Don't pass up that point. Go back over and look at it, grab a hold of it. So, verse 4. And when they were on their way, who will roll away the stone? Verse 4. When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. Mark adds that very large aspect to it. It is in the Greek on there. I would classify it more as a verbiage that says this stone is massive, and translating it to English. It was very large. What does that tell you? Yeah. What'd you say? It wasn't easy. That whoever was inside that tomb couldn't just arbitrarily recover from the crucifixion. By the way, I'm picking up something here. Couldn't recover from the crucifixion after being hung all those hours, being stabbed and whatever, push the stone out of the way. That kind of accusation in terms of what happened to Jesus' body is just not, that he suddenly came out of the death and half death and did it himself. Not possible. Where we at? As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Not unusual to be alarmed. Every passage we get in tombs, and multiple times we see people encountering the angels and getting shook up about it. Judges tells us that in 4 or 5 times We get it in Daniel. Daniel is absolutely petrified. And the 8th chapter, that somebody tapped him on the shoulder and said, you know, I got a job for you. You know, it shook him up. It would shake us up. They were shook up when they went in there. Now they were shook up for all kinds of reasons, not least of which what else? What else is in there? Nothing. Nothing. That's what else is in there. They had anticipated that they were going to buy spices. They spent money to buy spices. They woke up some store owner that morning and said, I'm buying spices from you. I got a job to do. They walk in there. They don't know how they're going to get the stone away, on and on and on. And they come in there, and there's some guy sitting in there with white robes on, and Jesus is not there. Did he push the stone out of the way? No. Stone is already out of the way, and he's gone, etc. It is crucial that we look at this aspect of the crucifixion, because Jesus is resurrected and he's gone. What does he say to him? What's the verbiage? You are looking for the Jesus of the Nazarene, by the way, that's a derogatory term, who was crucified. He has risen, and more importantly, he's not here. Look at where he's supposed to be. He's not here. Lee Strobel, I don't know if you know the name, wrote a bunch of apologetic letter and books on the risen Christ, etc., etc. He was an absolute atheist, Chicago writer, newspaper writer, convinced himself that, you know, that his wife was a Christian. He was going to convince her that she was all wrong. Went about studying and finally decided, uh-oh, this is real. And has become a great apologetic speaker ever since. But I was at that conference one time when he was challenged there. After each one of these conferences and you give a presentation, usually 1,000 people line up to ask questions. One of them was an Islamic follower. Well, what is the difference between Muhammad and Jesus? His answer, empty grave. Muhammad, you'll find at Medina and in Saudi Arabia, if you want to go visit there, and they know exactly where it is. His body is there. Jesus is not there. That's where he was supposed to be, but he's not there. That's what this angel tells them. Make sense?
Was the man in there an angel?
Huh?
Was the man sitting in there an angel?
Well, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that question. Matter of fact, every question is good, so just ask him if you have other. The description we have of him, there's no question about him being an angel. We know that because Matthew talks about him being an angel, and we see that description used with other angels multiple times. Mark doesn't even bother to tell you that. He just makes the assumption that he's supposed to be there, that he is an angel. Mark was writing this text, and eventually you'll hear me repeat this. Mark was writing this text probably from Rome, and he's getting information from Peter. We know that because Papias, writing in 125 or so, says that. Tells us that Mark got his information from Peter, and that's what, and he translated. And Mark undoubtedly wrote this and gave it to the Roman church where he was at. Probably by AD 59 is when Mark writes his gospel. The first one. I know Matthew's in all of our begins our gospel, but Mark was really the first. Mark was really the first gospel. Matthew probably wrote his in 62, 63. Luke writing in 64 maybe, and John, of course, writing in 96. Got all that? Nobody cares about those dates, except me, huh? Just Mark was the first text that was written, and we'll talk about it next Sunday, but He writes it quite a bit differently than even the other two synoptic gospels. What do I mean by synoptic? Huh?
Similar?
Yeah, I knew you knew the answer. It means in Greek the similar. That is, Mark is similar to Matthew and Luke. John is considerably different, not least of which he writes a generation almost later. And Matthew and Luke probably took the information from a lot of it from Mark, because you can find 90% of Mark in Matthew and Luke. So he's writing this to a church that's going to be attacked in an unbelievable way. And he needs you to understand that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the anointed one, that Jesus is the one in which was predicted on there. And then he's going to talk about the sufferings Messiah. That's the latter half of Mark's book. And here he does that because the church in Rome was going to encounter a great deal of persecution, not least of which half of Rome got on fire and Nero blamed the Christians. And so when he did that, they went about collecting up Christians and burning them at the stake and doing all kinds of things. They were going to be persecuted. They needed to know that their Lord and Savior is indeed the Messiah, and that the message is new and grasping and important and critical to their lives. Not the persecution, that's always going to be with you. Not any of the criticisms that you get, that's always going to be with you. I'm about to make a point here. I know you're waiting for it. And none of those things are unimportant. But what he's saying, the most important thing in your entire life is that you believe and accept Jesus as your Messiah, the anointed one, the one that, yes, was persecuted, and the one that's resurrected. Now, he's about to, and that's what's going to happen here. Now, let's go on, and I'll finish that point in just a second. What was they told to do? They see him, that's where he was supposed to be, and then that 7th verse, now, go tell the disciples, and Peter, he's going ahead of you in Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you he would. And he does that in the 14th chapter. He does that in the 8th and 9th chapter. He does that in the 10th chapter. All those you can get references to. And if you've got a reference Bible, you can chase all those down. I can give them to you if you need to. Now, what do they do? This is our message this morning. If I get nothing else across, what is it that they do? They do the same thing. What is it that they do? Did they run back to Galilee and tell their disciples?
No, they were too afraid.
They were petrified. Absolutely petrified. Why? Because they saw an empty grave. Because they saw an angel. They had every reason to be petrified. You and I would be petrified as well. Our leader, our teacher for the last 3 years, one in which we had hoped that he would be the one. That's what the people said on the in Luke, the 24th to Emmaus, 24th chapter. We had anticipated that he was going to be the one, and now he's not, and I'm disappointed, I'm upset. They were upset. But they have a job to do. Did they do it? That's what Mark wants you to think about. That's what Mark wants you to think about. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Mark ends it there. And for a very good reason. Now, a lot of people didn't like it, so they added the 19th through the 20th verse. That's why I tackled this to begin with. They didn't like it because it just sort of ended. It didn't give us the resurrection appearances. Did Mark mean that they wouldn't be resurrected? Absolutely not. He begins his book out in first verse and first chapter, first verse, and says, the Messiah, he's the one. 8th chapter, Jesus predicts that he was going to be, that he was going to die and he was going to be resurrected. 9th chapter, he predicts he's going to die and be resurrected. 10th chapter, he does the same kind of thing. All of those tells us that Mark firmly believed, without question, that Jesus was going to be resurrected. He saw no need to put that in the narrative. By this time, AD 59, what has occurred? How do we know that people know about the resurrection?
He's reappeared.
What?
He's reappeared to the disciples.
Well, he does. But how do we know that? Something was written down in the 15th chapter of, anybody? 1 Corinthians. He appears to all kinds of people, and 1 Corinthians 15 was written in 53 AD, before the first gospel was written. Paul said, I'm going to remind you of the things that I've been talking to you about, and one of the things, and I preached to you, and I've told you a number of times that Jesus was resurrected, and that a gazillion people had seen him. I think he said 400, but okay. Gazillion works. Yeah. There's no question in Mark's mind when he writes this gospel that Jesus was resurrected. There's no question in his mind that Jesus predicted the resurrection. There's no question in his mind that the early church had been walking around telling him about for 25 years that Jesus was resurrected. But he puts a note in there to challenge you and his readers and says, if you're being persecuted, you still need to tell the world that Jesus is going to be there. Brothers and sisters, if there's a point to be made here when you're reading that verse, it should be that you and I are looking in the mirror and saying, what am I going to do with the information I have? My Jesus has been resurrected and he's gone. Now, what am I going to do? Am I going to run scared? Yes. Am I eventually going to get around telling the disciples? Yes, they eventually get around telling the disciples. We know that from a number of reasons, not least of which he's talking to Peter when he's writing this thing. And the fact that Jesus started in Galilee and a whole bunch of other things that I don't have time to talk about. The important thing is, what are we going to do with the challenge that Mark throws up at us in that verse 8? That's a challenge to us. It's not just talking about a bunch of women 2,000 years ago. It is talking to us. Am I afraid when I get the gospel to go talk to somebody? Absolutely. What am I going to do? Am I going to eventually go talk to somebody and tell them that's what they did? What are you and I doing today with it? That's the question Mark asks right here. Not that kind of vocabulary, but certainly the question. What are you going to do with the risen Jesus? Because he's not where he was supposed to be. He is alive and walking around and part of the lives. What are you going to do with him? Was Jesus having suffered? Mark spends half of his book, from the 8th chapter, verse 22. That's another hint, by the way. Verse 22 to the end of it, telling us that Jesus, one, is the Messiah. He established that in 1 through 8. And secondly, this same Messiah is going to suffer and be ridiculed and be criticized and be challenged on and on and on to establish the fact that we have a suffering servant, Isaiah 53. Now, the question Mark says, are you a suffering servant? Are you going to go tell the world? That world can mean the person at the post office box, grocery store, your neighbor, or somebody else on the phone, that Jesus has risen. That's the challenge each one of us has this morning when we look at these first 8 verses. Don't worry about the rest of it, about the resurrection appearances. None of those kind of things matter. What are you and I doing with that information? Comment, question. I'm almost done. I don't have a choice. My time is cut off. Does this make sense to you? Is this challenging to you? Does it get you upset somewhat? Yeah. Am I doing enough? No. How am I supposed to do more? Let's go tell people about being a disciple. That's what Mark has to say here in these verses. That's what it's all about. It's not complicated. It's not easy, but it isn't complicated. You don't have to read Greek or any of the other stuff or memorize history dates or any of that kind of stuff I throw at you. All you have to do is say, my Jesus has risen. And I'm going to go tell the world about it. My world, my immediate world, my neighbors, on the telephone, post office, grocery store owner, whatever. I need to be telling them about it. We're done. I don't have any more time. Wednesday night, please come join us. Read the verses 8 to 20 through 25. Jesus performs that miracle that seems unbelievable. Just unbelievable. And I'm going to tell you why. Have a good day.